One of the common arguments against Islam or the Prophet Muhammad or the Quran that Christian apologists usually say is that the Prophet Muhammad copied off Christian apocryphal material, mainly Gnostic material, like the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, the Arabic Infancy Gospel, uh, the Gospel of Pseudo Matthew, etc., etc. So they say that the Quran copies uh, of Gnostic traditions as opposed to Orthodox Christian traditions. Well, it is true that the Quran uh, does have stories in it that's found in the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, for example, or these Christian apocryphal sources. That's true. I'm not denying that. But the problem is that these Christians need to read their New Testament because not everything about Jesus made it into the New Testament. Some oral stories about Jesus and his family and his disciples, uh, by oral tradition, made it into New Testament apocryphal works. How do we know? How do we know this? We know this because the New Testament itself says so. We read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 15. So then, brothers and sisters, stand firm and hold on to the traditions which you were taught, whether by, and this is the important part, whether by word of mouth or by letter from us. So according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 15, there were oral traditions about Jesus, that were circulating in the first century. So it could be that, you know, there were stories of Jesus making clay birds that didn't make it into the New Testament, but by oral traditions that originated in the first century, made it into the New Testament apocryphal works. Further, we read in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verse 25, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. So, what the author of the Gospel of John is saying is that Jesus did many things which are not recorded in the New Testament Gospels, which are not recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So, it's very possible by oral tradition that there were certain miracles and stories about Jesus and his family, like the Virgin Mary, that didn't make it into the New Testament, but by oral tradition went into the second century and the third century and made it into these New Testament apocryphal gospels, and that the Quran is confirming that there are true stories found in these New Testament apocryphal sources. There's nothing unbelievable about this, and Christians can't disprove this hypothesis because according to their New Testament, according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 15, there were oral traditions circulating in the first century which weren't written down but were passed down to later generations of Christians. And according to the Gospel of John chapter 21 verse 25, Jesus did many things which were not written down. So these could be oral stories of Jesus that circulated in the first century and were written down in the second and third century. Even Christian apologists like Don Stewart say that this is certainly possible. So even Christian apologists say that there could be true stories in the Christian apocryphal or the New Testament apocryphal works. So uh, my explanation is that the Quran, that there were true stories found in these New Testament apocryphal works, and the Quran is confirming that there are true stories. So that's why you find, you know, these stories of Jesus making clay birds, speaking in infancy, etc., etc., in the Quran, which are also found in New Testament apocryphal works, because there were true stories to begin with that didn't make it down, that didn't that were not written in the New Testament, but by oral tradition passed on into the second century and third century apocryphal works. So this is just my 2 cents on why the Quran quotes or repeats stories found in New Testament apocryphal sources. I don't think it's a threat to the validity of the Quran. Stay tuned, more videos coming up.